Welcome to our next lecture on the Kuzari. All those of you participating today and those of you who are watching the recordings in the various places or listening in the podcasts, we are in the Ma'amar Shlishi, that is the third essay. We are about to learn paragraph number 50. That's 50 or Os Nun. And the page numbers I'll be reading is in this version, the Korupkin translation. So we are on page 353. Now we are in the middle of a very, actually, no, did I start? Yeah, I did start recording. Okay. We're in the middle of a very important discussion when it comes to the Kuzari's outlook on how and why we keep mitzvot. And it's in the context of a discussion between the Kuzari, the Chazar king, and the Chaver, the rabbi, and they're discussing together um, the difference between the Karaite Jews and the Rabbinite Jews. And the argument that the Kuzari is making is that the Karaite Jews are basically on their own making assumptions about what the Torah means and why. And because they're doing it on their own, they may be sometimes very pious, outwardly speaking, because when they assume the Torah is teaching something, they're going to keep that scrupulously. But they make up the rules as they go along without following the accepted halacha that's been handed down for thousands of years. So because they do that, they're in a lot of danger because they're not keeping the law as it was supposed to be kept. And they're constantly reinterpreting, misinterpreting, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the reason why this whole debate is very important is because it sheds light on how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi understands the reason why we do mitzvot. And Rabbi Halevi made it very clear. We do mitzvot because this is the path that God gave us to achieve the spirituality that God wants us to achieve in this world, and that this is the only path. And by following these rules, we achieve that path. So the bottom line is we have to do it because God said so, not because of a reason that we imagine to be the case. Now, remember, we pointed out several times, and I can't help it, but we're going to say it again, that this is a very different approach from the Maimonidean approach, which deliberately looks for reasons. And the Rambam, remember, explicitly said, don't say like those rabbinic thinkers who think that you're not supposed to look for the reasons for the mitzvot, but since we're learning the Kuzari, let's try to understand his point of view. And the point of view basically comes out that if you're going to do it the way you think, you can make mistakes, and you can make a lot of mistakes, and you're going to end up not doing things you're supposed to, and so on. So Amar Kuzari in Nun in 50, the Chazar king then responds to that, which you'd have to listen to last week, 49, which was a long one. Kivan Shadavar Kain, since that is the case, Animoda l'Rabboni, I admit to you as the rabbinical Jew, the rabbinite Jew, Shemekabeitz Eilesh Shnei Hapanim, right? That the one who brings these two things together, right? Both the devotion to Torah and sticking to the halacha as we know it, right? So you can see he has an advantage over the Karaite Jew, both in what we can see and in what we can't see. In his Rav can translate his internal devotion to God. Such a person will feel good about his Torah, right? He'll feel good about his observance of the Torah, right? Because he knows that he's doing it right. So you have that sense of certainty. So what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi here is arguing is that if you keep the halacha and you do X, Y, and Z as halacha prescribes, then you can walk home knowing I did what I was supposed to do. Now, the exact type of certainty which Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and his approach towards keeping halacha gives one is one of the reasons why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's approach is so popular in modern time. All of us want to do the right thing. We all want to know that we're living the right way. So if halacha says that at this time in the morning you daven shachris, and at this time in the afternoon you daven mincha, and so on, and you do that, you're good to go. You got it in, right? And So you feel good about what you're doing. You got it done right. You buy a mezuzah that was written properly in the proper parchment and the proper letters and so on. So and how do we know? Because this is a because we know that we accepted this from the sages and the rabbis that are the true rabbis who accepted this all the way back to God Himself. However, the Karaite, the V'im tagia hishtadluso masha tagia. No matter how high he gets, he's always unsure. He's never sure that he got it right. Right? Lo yitav libo v'neshu yodea hishtadluso sfara v'yakasha. He knows that his efforts are based on his thought process and based on what he thinks. Is what I think right or wrong? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm trying, but he's always wondering. Now, if it strikes you that it's that wondering that is exactly the perplexed, right? That the guide for the perplexed was written for. It was countering this sense of surety, this sense of certainty that I'm doing it right. What we learned from the Rambam was exactly the opposite of this idea, that people want to have a sense of certainty, but a proper scholar, a proper person, is always going to be uncertain, even about the most fundamental things. The philosopher and the excellent philosopher in the Rambam's understanding is someone who is in a state of perplexity and always wondering. However, Rabbi Yehuda Levi is giving us the engine that drives the desire to keep halacha strictly, because then you can go to sleep knowing that I got it right. I mean, try to think yourselves which path makes sense to you. You know, what turns you on more, certainty or uncertainty? Can you be certain if you eat an exact amount of matzah on Pesach night, you'd fulfill the mitzvah? So Rambam would say no. Rabbi Yehuda Levi would say yeah, right? So here we are at really a crux of a major difference between the two of them. He knows, so the Karaite knows that his efforts are just based on his own ideas, and they may be wrong, right? He'll never have confidence that this action that he's doing, is the specific action that God wants, right? And he will know that there's other people, that I'm not the only devoted person, right? There's other people in other nations that are also devoted to God, and they may be much more devoted than I am. And they may be trying harder. They may be working harder. They might be more spiritually on a higher level than me. Now, again, in the Maimonidean sense, that wouldn't be a problem. Okay, so there are people in other nations that are more spiritual than me. Okay, fine. Great. Let's learn from them how to grow higher. That's how the Rambam would approach it. Rabbi Yehuda Levi would say that no, the path of Torah is the one and only path to God, and this has to be the right one. It has to be better than the other path, right? Not that there aren't other paths, but this has to be the best. But I still need to ask you. I don't understand this mitzvah, and fascinating because this particular, well, I don't know if calling it a mitzvah, but this halachic method is something that people still say today. In some of the Erev fights, when a Jewish community growing wants to build an Erev, we often find that the people get some communities that they get upset about it, and there's all kinds of court fights. Anyway, so one of the things that some people that is often some hints of, or maybe even more than hints, overt anti-Semitism involved in these things. Say, what are these Jews doing? They're putting up this wire. It's some kind of trick that allows them to do something that they're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Right? You're not allowed to carry, and they hang up a wire, and all of a sudden, poof! Now they're allowed. Like it seems to them like some kind of trick to get out of our Shabbos obligations. So he therefore asks, I want to ask you about this leniency regarding the mitzvah, the commandment of keeping Shabbos. How is it possible that which God said you're not allowed to do, we do some trick and now we're allowed to do it? So the Chaver answers in 51. Chas v'shalom sheyaskimu hamon chasidim v'chachamim al ma sheyatir kosher mikishrei Torah, right? God forbid that so many people, so many great and wonderful sages would do something like. Of course, they're not untying. Like, to lahatir hachavila, to untie the bundle is a phrase meaning like you untie it and everything falls apart. That's not what they're doing. Achem mizarzim v'omrim. What they're doing is they're actually pushing us to keep the Torah better. How? Because they say asyu sag la Torah. We need to make a siyag. We need to make a fence around the Torah. In other words, make it harder for people to violate the laws of the Torah by adding rules that keep us away from violating the Torah. And what do they do that? One of the fences they made is now just a little bit of a short halachic discourse here. On Shabbos, there's several types of rishuyot, which are considered entities, spatial entities that exist in regarding the laws of Shabbos. One is a Rishus Harabim, which means translated means the public domain. Generally, like a busy street with lots and lots of people going and coming would be a public domain. Exactly what the technical details of a public domain are not the issue today for us to discuss. Then there's a private domain, which is, in your house or in your yard. If it's a fenced-in yard, that's a Rishus HaYachid, a private domain. And then there's a Carmelis. A Carmelis is just an open field or an area that's not fenced in. It's not private. It's also not public. It's not a marketplace. It's not a business. It's just a place, whatever. That's and then there's another one, a Makom Patur, which we don't need to talk about now. But regardless, the law of the Torah, as derived by the rabbis, is that one cannot carry either in a public domain or from a public to a private or private to a public, right? But the Carmelis, the status of a land which is neither, is not a Torah prohibition. There is no Torah prohibition against carrying in a Carmelis, right? And when the Chachamim said you can make an Erev, what they essentially were saying was, if you surround first of all, they had to make a decree you're not allowed to carry in a Carmelis on Shabbos. You're not allowed to. So, in other words, it wasn't illegal in the first place from the Torah. The Chachamim did it because they don't want us mistaking a public domain with a Carmelit, which is kind of sort of like a public domain, but not exactly. So they made a siyag, they made a fence, don't carry in a Carmelis. And once they made that siyag, they also made a way out by saying, if you surround it with a barrier of some sort, even if it's just a symbolic one, then it will get the law of a Rishus HaYachid, of a private domain. So no one, so I'm reading from his words. The law was bringing things in and out from a private to a public or vice versa. Mashalo also said the Torah never made it usher in the first place. The Torah never prohibited that. And then they made a leniency within this thing. Why? In order that we realize and understand that the laws regarding carrying in a Carmelis are not the same force as the laws carrying from a public to a private domain. So that people could have some freedom in using such land on Shabbos, but only with permission, and that is by making the Erev Kadeshatia Hakara, so people should understand the difference between that which is completely permitted and that which is aser and that which is prohibited, obein hasiyag, and that which was a decree declared by the rabbi. So the Erev is not a catch-22, making something that's otherwise not allowed. You can't take a Rishus Harabim and make it a public domain and make it into a non-public domain by putting up an Erev. Nowadays, the Erev works because almost no place today has the technical status as a public domain for reasons which are beyond our discussion today. So Nun Beis 52. So the Chazar said, okay, that's a fine enough answer. How does it work that when you put this Erev, this symbolic thing, that it somehow brings these properties together? How does a symbolic thing make it into one place? So the Chaver says, you know what? You don't know a lot about how the halacha works and how the mitzvot work, because that's not a good question at all. It's a little bit disrespectful the way he answers the king, but okay. What about when somebody transfers land from one property to another, or if I want to sell you my table, so So we write a contract, or we do a symbolic act. I give you $10, and then whatever. We do a symbolic act that transfers property. What made this go from domain A, mine, to domain B, yours? Just a symbolic act, right? This happens all the time with money, with servants, l'kichas hakinyan v'atzava, right. I just turned the page to 356. If you have a woman who all of a sudden was in a status of permissible to others, all of a sudden she's now only married to one and prohibited to others. When he says teheli mikudesh, when he says be married, it's just a statement, and poof, her whole status changes. The hatorasa are the same thing when he says write a contract of divorce. B'chol mashesh b'Torah Kohanim, we have it all over the Chumash Vayikra, Leviticus. Certain things, there's just a symbolic action that changes the status of things. So, for example, the leprosy that grows on clothing, right, or the house, becomes tameh when the Kohen pronounces it's tameh. All he did is makes a pronouncement, and poof, its halachic status changes. V'chol hamishkana lo chola hakedusha aleh ela ba'akomas Moshe es hamishkan v'hamashicha b'shemen hamishcha. The tabernacle in the desert became holy when Moshe put it up, and then he anointed it with oil. Again, a symbolic act that all of a sudden now it's changed its status. And the Kohanim, they had a process of becoming priests, right? There was a process the Torah records of the Miluim and the waving of the Kohanim and the Levites, a similar process. V'taher atmeim, and how people who are tameh, who are ritually impure, become pure b'meinida with the ashes of the paraduma, of the red heifer, ve'ezo v'shnitzlah, in these other plants that are in the mixture. V'chitei habayis b'shnei tziparim chayos amlachahi, and how you cleanse a house with leprosy in it by the ceremony with the two birds, right? The kippur ha'avonos b'yom kippurim, and how is it that our sins become forgiven on Yom Kippur with this whole process, right? And so on. I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit, skipping a few words here and there. And how is it that blessing is bestowed upon the people by a pronouncement by the priests? So the bottom line is what he's trying to make is that we all accept. He lists Torah examples, but we find it in secular examples too. There's symbolic acts, a statement, an agreement, a signature, which changes the legal status of anything. So what's the big deal about a string making the change of the legal status of the thing? Why does that seem like such a big deal to you? It should be pretty understandable. Right? The bottom line of this is, remember the Inyan Eloki, the special divine specialness that rests among the Jewish people, which is a basic tenet of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's thought, which has come up repeatedly over and over again. These acts, how does it work? It's because these symbolic acts make a status change of this divine presence, right? So basically, he's standing firm on his argument that there is a divine presence, some sort of a special holiness. It's like a measurable, actual thing that changes. And the way it's changed is when we do the ceremony or the statement or the whatever it is prescribed by the Torah to make that thing happen. And the human being can't possibly know how. Do you choose a red heifer? How much do you put in of this azo? How much do you put in of that? How do you do this? How many times do you say that? And so on. Because we don't have access to the spiritual knowledge to know how to make these spiritual changes and things. Because we don't know how to get the exact amount when you mix together the four basic elements. Remember, this is all ancient Greek physics, where they believed in the four basic elements: earth, fire, water, and air, that make up everything. Right? The slightest change in the form of anything that we come across is changed by even the tiniest difference in the how you mix the elements together. And if you change a tiny thing, it will all get ruined. For example, you look at an egg, right? So you have to do a mikra ma'at, a tiny little bit, too much heat or too much cold or too much shaking it around, it won't develop into a bird, right? It has to be exact, right? And if the chicken sits on it for 3 weeks, then it'll become a real chicken. So if that's true regarding physical objects, how much more true is that regarding spiritual objects? How do we spiritually change the status of object A and turn it into to take object A and change its status? Only by doing exactly the process prescribed by the Torah. So we're getting a sense here for Rabbi Yehuda Levi's understanding of how mitzvot work. There's this spiritual essence that changes. So when you hang a mezuzah on the door, you're not just doing like the Rambam taught us, putting something on the door because it's a physical reminder of God's protection. When we walk in and out of our house, it reminds us of it's not our door. We're ultimately dependent upon God, right? It's not a concept, an idea that makes sense, which is how Rambam explained it, but rather it is an actual thing that's happening. When you hang the mezuzah, you have changed the spiritual status of your house to a protected house. And now it is more protected by that spiritual presence. Whether or not this approach speaks to you is a subject we can discuss, but this is Rabbi Yehuda Levi's understanding, and it's, of course, a very prevalent one in Jewish thought today. And similarly, the people who divine the spirits and bring up spirits of the dead, or people that do the alchemy and mix the chemicals to make whatever. The alchemists are thinking that if we get exactly the right mix of things, we can convert one thing into another. You can convert, one metal into gold or whatever. We just have to get the exact right amounts of this, and this, and we can do it. I'm just like in if you take the body heat that resides, and now again in ancient human physiology, they believe that there was an innate heat in the body that emanates from the heart and spreads throughout the whole body. And that's what makes this bag of bone, skin, and flesh and turns it into a living being, which is all interacts with the parts interacting with each other as one human being. So just like that happens, right? They're trying as hard as they can to find exactly the right heat in order to turn whatever lead into gold or whatever metal they're trying to do. And their experiments or the things that they've seen happen in the world, right, fools them into thinking right? They think that because when they see phenomenon taking place where one thing turns into another, they think they discovered things, right? In a similar way, when a person sees that semen deposited within a woman, within a human being, all of a sudden grows into another human being. And when it comes to the people who do spiritual things, divine the spirits and the ghosts or whatever they're divining, right? When they heard that the the types of revelations that people had at the time of the Beis Hamikdash during the time of the sacrifices, when they saw special miracles happen in the Beis Hamikdash, so they see these things, so they think that it's a scientific event. It's not a spiritual event. If we can manipulate the spirits, we can access these visions. So, right? And they think that the prophets were not actually speaking with God, but rather they knew how to manipulate the divine spirits in order to hear messages. And they figured, well, we just figure out the exact right mix, the exact right chant, the exact right incense or whatever, we'll get it down. And looking at different astrological signs to figure out how to do things and when to do things and where, etc. According to what they think makes sense to them. Imasim uketoras, together with incense and various, rituals. Right, all kinds of idolatrous practices, which is not even worth. We shouldn't even. We should even prohibited to discuss. And another group of people that use names, like godly names, in order to achieve things. They think that such and such prophet said some great prophecy, and some miracle happened. They think that it was because of this certain speech, a certain way he said it, some formula that, whatever, like, an abracadabra, poof, and now it's better, such a thing happens. Who they think that's the reason. But the truth is, none of these actions that happen, none of these spiritual actions that happen in the Beis Hamikdash or any of these places are natural occurrences. They're not natural occurrences. These are similar to natural occurrences, right? In the sense that if you do X, Y happens. But what is the X and Y? The X is if you do what the Torah says according to how the Torah teaches it, then you will have that spiritual result that you're looking for. Then the Beis Hamikdash will be holy. And then you may actually achieve those levels because you're following the instructions that God gave you. Let's say, for example, you had never heard of anything such as sexual intercourse, right? You never knew it existed. You didn't know how it happened, and you didn't know what the result of sexual intercourse was, which obviously is referring to pregnancy and the ultimate birth of a baby. So v'tira atzmacha nizkak el hakor shebe'evri isha, and then you find yourself the part of a woman's body that is the most hidden part, the most, what he describes as a dirty part. This is, not to be insulting to anyone, but this is how they thought of these things in those days. So let's leave it at that. And you would know that if some lowly substance, in this case the blood, the way they're looking at it, that's inside her, submitting yourself to a woman and do such a disgusting thing, if you never heard of it, okay, you'd be wondering, what in the world are these actions, this action of sexual intercourse from this? It's just ridiculous, right? How is it that all of a sudden something like me, another human being, pops out? Nolad min ha'isha is born. So Yeracha Davar, right? So you see, right? What you would conclude, I mean, you think that you brought about creation. That God wants you to be the one that settles the world. The same thing is true for the divinely measured, the things that the Torah prescribes to accomplish deeds. So the Torah tells you, Tishchat hakeves, you slaughter the sheep, for example, al hadimyon. V'tislach lech b'damo v'afshataso v'chitas mea v'adachaso. You do this whole process of playing the blood and flaying the hide and so on and so forth, and cutting up the thing and spraying the blood on the mizbeach, on the altar, and setting up the wood to burn it. V'ilu lo haya b'mitzvas elokim, if this wasn't something that God could, you think this is very distant from God. But I'm just reminding you again how Rambam understood the purpose of Karbanot, and Rabbi Yehuda Levi is presenting a completely different purpose, right? And that is that by doing this process that the Torah prescribes, we create a spiritual result. The asher yishlam karoi v'teraish, you think until it's completed totally, right? And and if this was I mean, you would make fun of these things, right? But if they're done exactly, and then all of a sudden you see the fire coming down exactly the way God commanded, right? Or if you were to find yourself all of a sudden have this great feeling, this great spirit that comes upon you, which Rabbi Yehuda Levi understands, you have this a special tangible feeling when you come in contact with spirituality, right? Then Ochalamosa mitios, or suddenly you had true dreams, true prophetic type dreams, or gedolos, or great dreams. Teda Kihem told us Mashek Damta. Then you would finally understand that this is a result of what you did. So again, Rabbi Yehuda Levi is positing that when you do these processes, these rituals, and you have a feeling of holiness, that's a real feeling. I beg you to think for a minute how Rambam would understand that. Would he think that that feeling is an actual tangible thing? He wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing to be happy that you did what God wanted, that sense of happiness that we have. But he certainly wouldn't describe it in the way Rabbi Yehuda Levi is. And it wouldn't even be crazy to you to it wouldn't even be difficult to understand that even death can result from this attachment to God. That's just the end of the body. But the nefesh, the soul, reaches such a high level that it's so high it can't come down. So it ends up attached to heaven, and then the person could even pass away. Below rochak min hamadrega, it's not far from that. So what's the point of all of this? It is clear from all this, ki ein kurva ela Elohim ela b'mitzvos olim. The only way to approach God is to do the mitzvos that God commanded. That is how you reach God, period. All right, there is no other way, right? And the only way you could know what God's commands are is miderach nevuah, is by knowing the prophecies that of the prophets that taught us. Most importantly, of course, Moses, but all of them. Lo ba'kasha, so not because you thought about it, not because you philosophized, not because you decided that it makes sense, but because God said so. And between us, right, the only attachment that we have to God is by accepting the tradition that we received through the reliable sources. Because they gave us these mitzvahs. It wasn't just one guy. It wasn't one prophet who came along and told us do this and don't do that. There were many, right? Many sages over the centuries have taught us the Torah that we have. That the words of the prophets reached. Even if all there was were just the elders and the priests and the Levites from those days, right? They would not have, the Torah would not have stopped from Moshe on down. So I'm going to reiterate real quickly, and I want to open the door to questions. The bottom line of Rabbi Yehuda Levi is the understanding. The only way to God is through the instructions God gave us. The instructions God gave us, we received through the traditions by the rabbis. Anything else you do because of your own thoughts and your own mind is going to lead you almost inevitably into the wrong direction. This is, I am curious to hear from you guys what you think. Is this a dominant approach in Judaism today? Do you hear things like this? And do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Feel free to be open. But remember, you are being recorded, so be careful. But fire away.
Well, it certainly is contrary to Reform Judaism and its premise. Indeed, I've heard many times, because I'm part of that community for a large portion of my life, it's really difficult to be a Reformed Jew, that you can't just read or be told what to do. To exercise great creativity, and it's a more difficult path to pursue. So that's
literally exactly. I think it's a very good comparison. I'm not super familiar with. I did not spend parts of my life, but to the extent that I've spoken to Reform Jews, to the extent that I've visited Reform synagogues in my life here and there every once in a blue moon, I that's what I gather. But and my place now here is not to obviously I'm an Orthodox Jew, but the contrast is very, very similar. I agree, and I was thinking the same thing, because once you say you do what makes sense to you. You do what feels right to you. You do what, nowadays in today's times, so that what's meaningful to you. Once you open that package, so then you never know if the problem with this. So finding is it the right path? So it's challenging. It's much easier to be told these are the instructions. You follow the instructions, you're good to go, right? The problem is that the Rambam, who was just as orthodox, right, would have said and did say, and we learned this together, that's not the goal. The goal is not to know for sure that you got it all right, right? The Rambam wrote a guide for the perplexed people, right? He was teaching the people who were perplexed. That, like, literally, he wrote an entire book to counter this idea, right? Being perplexed, that's the height, right? Rambam wrote, I forget exactly the passage, but you can see. But maybe I'll text it out later. But the idea that the height of knowledge is when you realize how little you know. The Rambam was willing to entertain doubt about the most fundamental parts of Judaism. Right? He was willing to entertain doubts. Was the world created in time, or was the world always in existence? Those were some of the big philosophical questions of his day. Right? You and I might not lose sleep over that question, but then they did. Right? So the fundamental questions, being perplexed about them was the point, right? And thinking of and that. So but what you find today is a lot of people are attracted to orthodoxy because they want certainty, because they want to know, because they want to feel like, if I do all this, and there's a corollary which Rabbi Levi didn't mention, which I do find in many people, and that is, I'm doing the right thing, and therefore I will be okay, right? Now, they might be thinking I'll be okay, I'm going to go to heaven, and I won't. But many of them are also thinking, therefore, I'm going to be able to pay my bills at the end of the month, and I'm going to be able to get over this illness or whatever it is, because they want to know. Give me the instructions and let me follow. They want certainty. People want certainty, and it's the way it's why many people are religious at all. I hear sometimes, I hear a common argument from Christians that you hear, bouncing around the streets and the internet is like, listen, you could live and believe in Christianity, or you could not believe, but what do you lose? Believe in it, because the worst case is whatever. But if you don't, if assuming you follow their line, if you don't believe, you can end up in hell, and that's a disaster, right? So you might as well. So in other words, believe, because then you can be sure, right, that you'll be
Well,
okay.
so a lot of it has to do with personalities. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's some personalities that need this. They need
Uh-huh.
assurance that this is the way it is. You do it this way. You dot your I's, you cross your T's, and everything's going to be good. And I feel good about that. And I don't feel good if I don't do it that way, because that's the way I do everything in my life. Everything is a certainty. Everything is,
Mm-hmm.
by the book.
Yep.
Okay. And so people live their lives like that. That's their personality. That's the way they do it. And they're attracted to this.
Mm-hmm.
There are other people that are questioners. And many people in science are that way. They question things. It doesn't mean that they discount or disbelieve this particular
Uh-huh.
halacha.
Right.
It's that they want to understand it. They want to grasp it. They want to understand how it is put together. What are the components of this, and why is it that way? And that's what Rambam does. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
basically says that and
Mm-hmm.
takes that approach. It doesn't mean that you don't believe that, but you want to expand it and just not say that's it. So I think a lot of it has to do with people's personality,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of Orthodox Jews gravitate to Orthodox Judaism because it's a certainty religion. You
Right.
go in, you do it this way. I mean, I'm a little bit that way with some things. Like, for instance, I like going into a service, where everything is done the way it is done, and I'm very familiar with it, and I'm comfortable with the way the service goes, and
Mm-hmm.
it's the same way every time. And you read the Torah and you do this, and it's comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not comfortable in a situation where things are changing, where this week we're going to do it this way,
Right.
and so that would be uncomfortable for me. But other people are very comfortable with saying, let's change it this way and do that. We'll play around with it.
Mhm.
That's another example of something that's maybe a little bit different, but sort of similar.
Yeah.
Different personalities have different ways they look at things. So that's sort of the way I grasp it. I mean, there are people that do both now, and they do it because of their particular personality.
Yeah.
If I,
No,
if I
I agree with you. And when the Rambam talks about, what's necessary for necessary beliefs, what he calls for the common folk, you know,
Yeah.
because that's for them, they need that, they need that certainty. Um, you know, and you're right, because Rabbi Yehuda Levi is drawing here a dichotomy between those people who I don't know, I might lose power in a minute. My lights just flashed off. It's not even storming outside. Who knows? Anyway, so he's drawing a contrast between people that totally make it up on their own, right? Versus people that follow the halacha and therefore have a certain knowledge that they're doing the right thing. But that's not the only two paths, right? There's another path. The Rambam's path doesn't say make it up as you go along. He's totally committed to keeping halacha. And what I find is that if you follow the Rambam's path, and then it's not just about you do X, Y, and Z at this time of day, and then you say A, B, C, and then you're good to go and finished. But okay, why? Where does that come from? What's the origins of this? And all of a sudden it becomes really cool, because 99 times out of 100, you learn something really interesting when you delve into the Torah like that. That 100th time, it's not because the interesting thing isn't there, it's because you didn't figure it out. But there's always something interesting to be learned. But there's and it always leads to more questions. Like you solve one riddle only to bring up two more riddles, but it makes it fascinating, it makes it interesting, it makes it meaningful. Of course we still keep the Torah, and then all of a sudden, and those moments when you have that flash, that tiny flash of insight, that's how the Rambam described it, those flashes of insight when you see, oh my God, this is what it means. And it's like, wow. And then all of a sudden the flash goes away and you're left wondering, like with 6 other questions. That's the experience of the person that's not so sure, Yeah. So it's not a dichotomy. This, according to the Rambam, at least, it's not the same as the two alternatives that Rabbi Yehuda Levi lays out over here. But Rabbi Yehuda Levi is laying out a pretty solid argument, that just to give him credit for that, of not taking what Jeffrey described as the reform path. I'm sure there's lots of different reform Jews that think different way. But if you're constantly changing things up and saying, oh, this week we feel like it's better to do it this way for XYZ reason. Now, XYZ might be a good reason, right? But you can end up making a lot of wrong choices. Some of those choices might not be good ones. You might feel like it's good, and then all of a sudden you go next week, oh my goodness, what did we do last week? It's just that wasn't a good idea, So, but if you stick with the program, assuming, like Rabbi Yehuda Levi posits, that program comes straight from God, then you can't lose, right? You have to make that. Orthodoxy only stands if you make that assumption, right? That it comes from God through the traditions of the rabbis, etc. So let's see, Chaver and Kuzari, 54. We're on page 361. Says the Kuzari, Lo ra'isi anshe bayis sheni, right? I have not seen. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, I was just losing track of time, and my screen is different than usual, so I wasn't sure where. But okay, so I got it. You're telling me, right, that this traditions passed down through the generations all the way from Moshe, and the Chazar king, the Kuzari, is about to ask a question, which is a question you find in a similar form to this day. It's not historically true that the Jews were keeping halacha exactly the way we keep it now for the last several thousand years. It's just not true, right? This is what he's going to ask, all right? So, and scholars will do this all the time. If you and I were to go back 2,000 years and wander around Second Temple period Jerusalem, a lot of things that we're doing would be weird to us, and a lot of things that we think are normative Judaism, they wouldn't be doing, right? It's not true that it happened this way. He says, Lo re'isi anshe bayasheni el shekvar shachu Torah. It seems to me, right, that by the time the Second Temple period came around, the Torah had already, a lot of it had been forgotten. They had to examine. We find this in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. They forgot about building a sukkah, and all of a sudden they reminded themselves, and they forgot about lo yavu Ammoni Moavi, about the laws of marrying or not marrying an Ammonite or a Moabite, which was a debate according to the Talmud in the time of whether or not Ruth, should be allowed to marry Boaz and so on. But remember, it says there, and they found written in the Torah, because they didn't know it until now. So you see almost clear evidence. This is what it seems to be clear evidence in the Tanakh. That's almost like a Karaite approach, right? They didn't know, and they read the verse, and then they reignited the mitzvah without having that tradition to tell us how to build a sukkah, right? Or how to interpret the verse of an Ammonite. Does it refer to women or not? V'zerayal Abdon Torah must be, it was lost. You're claiming that this tradition was continuous. Clearly, from the Tanakh, it does not seem to have been continuous. So the Chaver says in 55, I am now on page 362, if that's the case, then we must be even smarter than them, because we know all of the Torah, right? According to our own opinion. And remember, in the Kuzari's thinking and Rabbi Levi's thinking, that's preposterous, right? The original ones that were closer to Moshe, that were closer to God, knew so much more than us. So the Kuzari says, can't anymore. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So how does this work? So the Chaver takes his sarcastic statement he made before, and he expounds on it in 57 and says, Im hayinu hayom mitzuvim lihakriv karbanos hehayinu yodim ech nishchatem. If somebody were to come down today and say, guys, start bringing sacrifices again, would we have had any idea exactly how to do this process? To how to slaughter them, and what side to slaughter them, how to catch the blood, how to cut it up, how to flay the hide, how many pieces to cut it into, how to put it here, how to spray the blood, how do we do these things? What is the song that we're supposed to sing when we do this, right? How exactly how the priests are supposed to dress, how are they supposed to anoint themselves, how are they supposed to wash themselves? How exactly do they eat? Was my name. There's so many things that we would have no idea what to do. So clearly we don't know, right? So Amar Kuzari, the Kuzari says, we would need to have some priest or some prophet to come and tell us. So Amar Chaver, so the Chaver said, right, hello Isa, you know that the Anshe Bayesheni in the Second Temple period, how did they build? Remember at the time when Ezra, when the first people came from exile from Babylon, they put up an altar before they built a temple. There was an altar there. That's written in the book of Ezra. So until God helped them, because they had opposition from the people of the land, they wanted to build a temple and they tried, and then they did. It was a whole story. So anyway. So, but then they finally built the temple, and then they finally built a wall. Do you think that they just simply offered sacrifices randomly? So the Chazar King says, no, it can't be, because that they should bring, if the mitzvah of bringing a burnt sacrifice in Ola, right? I'm in item paragraph 60, page 363 now. Yishlimu kol chalakel b'rshus habori u'mitzvaso, right? To do it in its proper way with all of its details and all the ways that God said so. Kol sheken shekvar yadu mitzvah Yom Kippurim. Certainly, they knew already how to do Yom Kippur, which is a very detailed process. Umashu gadol me'asukkah, exactly how large the sukkah should be. All of these things need all kinds of laws and teachers to tell us how to do them. So the Chaver says in 61, you think a person who knows all these details, will he know how to build a sukkah? Right? So then what does it mean? So in other words, so clearly they knew. So if that's the case, this is his proof, right? His proof is clearly they knew, because they're doing all these things. They're bringing carbonot. So obviously they must have known. It's sounds like kind of circular reasoning. because maybe they didn't know. Maybe they brought and didn't do all the rules right until somebody taught them. But either way, this is how his logic is working. So Amar Kuzari, the Chazer King says, Imkain, why does it mean that they found it written? If they knew, so why does it say they found it? So the Chaver says clearly, Hatama Baruhu, I'm in 63 now, on page 364. Shekosev hamikra lo hirgish lanistoros avol kosav hamufusamos aglios. Right, the author of the texts of the book of Ezra in this case, and Nehemiah, he did not concern himself with all of the details that we don't know, but rather he didn't list all of the rules that he got through Yoshua from Moshe, etc. But rather he wrote the big deals, these big events that everybody knew about. And that's so they didn't write every single detail, every single thing that happened in Yeshua. They wrote the main stories. All the stories in Shoftim and Melachim, etc. They didn't mention all of their teachings that David did and Solomon did. And they didn't describe how they kept the Torah. They just mentioned from the words of Shlomo, and they mentioned from his stories, from his events of his lifetime, his big meals, and how wealthy he was. They didn't mention all of his chachmos, except for the story of the two harlots. That was the story of cutting, suggesting to cut the baby in half in order to find out who the mother really was. But they didn't talk about all of the intelligent things, right, that he told the Queen of Sheba. Right? So, the bottom line is all these details aren't there. They were only mentioning the things that are famous that everyone knew about. The details, the things that only individuals in the time knew. Most people forgot about them except for a few individuals. One of the things that you could see planted here is the seeds for what eventually became Kabbalah, right? The whole idea. First of all, why is Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, called Kabbalah? The word Kabbalah means to accept something, right? It's to likabel, is to accept it. It's called Kabbalah because the entire body of Jewish mysticism depends for its validity as a Jewish, it considers itself a valid Jewish a system of thought, right? Because it was a Kabbalah, something that specific individuals accepted and learned from the people that preceded them, right? So they were claiming, so why don't we see it in the Gemara? Why don't we see it in the Mishnah? Why don't we see it in anywhere else? Because it was only a few people that accepted it from their teachers this entire time. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, by saying this about the scriptures themselves, right? He's saying the scriptures only recorded, main events, right? Popular events, not all the details. During that time, of course, there were individuals that knew this, but they were just individuals. And those prophetic teachings, those nevuos, they included special teachings that really helped us learn properly and clearly. When he wrote down the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, he only talked about that which was meforsam, that which was publicized. Everybody knows that in the time of Ezra, they decided to start keeping sukkahs again. So that's what they wrote. They kept sukkahs. They kept sukkahs. They built a sukkah. But the fact is that what they could have written, these are all the laws that they kept. There has to be X number of walls, this kind of schach, and so on and so forth. And they talked about it because everyone remembered how they went looking around for olive branches and hadas, myrtle branches, and lulavim, palm branches, and so on. Umasha Amar vayimsu ukasov. And that which it says, why does it say, and they found it written? It doesn't mean they found something that they'd have forgotten about. It means the people learned about sukkahs because they all of a sudden realized how important this is and they took it seriously. But of course there were individuals around. They didn't, everything, even the minor mitzvahs, the minor ideas that we accepted from the rabbis, they knew it all back then too. And the one who wrote it just wanted to talk about how great that day was, the day that they started keeping Sukkot again. Similar to the day that they banished Ammonites and Moabites from that were their enemies from the land. It was a big time to get rid of those nations, and it was a difficult process. And here he's referring to the Ammonite women that had married into Jewish families and separating the families. Exactly what happened there. I advise you to go to my podcast and read Ezra and Nehemiah. What that whole business with that is exactly what happened is interesting. It's worth reading the book, and you can listen to my podcast and you can see how I analyzed it there. But they, to separate the couples that were intermarried. I'm going to leave it at that. If we can talk about it another time in detail, but I advise that you read those books of Tanakh to really understand what really happened, or how you understand it when you interpret the verses, right? And this such a self-sacrifice, such a great thing, must have been really tough. And because this thing was so popular and so well known, they wrote down and recorded. They found it was written. It doesn't mean that they didn't know, that it was forgotten. Of course they knew. Of course there were rabbis that knew all the details. They just found when they reached that word, that verse that says the Ammonite and the Moabite should not marry into the congregation, they were all shaken and scared by that. All right, so I'm going to stop here today at the end of 63. We have a little bit of time for questions, so let's do that, and we'll continue from here. I think a little bit about how convincing you think his logic and arguments here. There's a lot of parts of this book, I know you guys pointed out, that I get very worked up on, and I think are absolutely beautiful ideas. But the logical arguments often fall flat with me. I'm just being honest. They just fall flat because it just it just does. I'm sorry, I'm admitting it. It does. but go ahead. If anyone has any comments or questions, please fire away.
Well, I would just like to add, I'm here at Chautauqua, 250th anniversary of the founding of the country, and we've had 2 days, 3 days, Ken Burns, and he's pointed out that this little document, Common Sense, all the difference. It was published in January of 1776. It was as popular as the Bible. It was held by most Americans, and it was designed to overthrow, of course, George's system. And it first time that they said to the common man, hey, let's do what makes common sense. There's individuals who can figure it out for themselves. They don't have to accept what was handed down, that there was a king and there was English law. They should try to figure things out for themselves. And I just note that and this made all the difference and led the Declaration of Independence. So I just note that our American tradition has problems with the Judah Halevi's basic premise.
Thank you. This part of the Kuzari lays bare really the difference between what a certain approach towards Judaism, which is sometimes called a mystical approach, not so much because it's mystical, but it is to some degree mystical. The idea that when I do a mitzvah the way the Torah prescribes, something happens, some spiritual entity changes, versus no, I'm doing this mitzvah because there's a reason why I'm doing it, and it changes me. It makes me into a different person when I do it the way I'm supposed to, and I'm supposed to be thinking, what kind of a person am I supposed to become? So, like when the Rambam writes, the Torah tells us to do certain mitzvahs so that you should learn generosity, or so that you should learn to be a better person. You should learn to be more devoted. You should learn the truth of God, right? So these mitzvot are designed to change us. They're not designed in order to change some spiritual entity. I'm not putting a mezuzah on my house because all of a sudden the force field lands from heaven and protects it. I'm putting a mezuzah in my house because I'm supposed to be thinking about what it says in that mezuzah and what it means for how I live my life. So that every time I walk through that doorway, I look at it, and it should. Obviously, it doesn't most of the time because I usually don't pay much attention. But if I did pay attention, I'd be thinking, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, God is one, right? Yeah. Well, what does that mean? I would be contemplating these things every time I walk into my home or out of my home, and 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 it's a very, very different understanding of what doing mitzvos is, and the purpose and point of doing it. But Rabbi Yehuda Levi does have a really good point that if you take that to its extreme and you trust your own judgment so much so that you don't keep the Torah anymore, right? And you decide whatever makes sense, I'll do it the way I think it makes sense. You end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? Because the truth is that no matter how smart or educated we are, there is so much in the Torah that we don't know and we don't see, and we could if we try. Remember, Rama made it really clear to say, even paraduma, there is a reason. Rama himself admitted, I don't know yet what it is, right? But there is one there. If you study hard enough, you can figure it out, right? There is something this mitzvah is supposed to do to us. He gave us certain hints on how to figure out those things. Right. But figure out was the idea in the Rambam. Learn it and understand it so that it changes you. It makes you a different person, not because of a magical force field or some spiritual presence or inyan eloki, as he describes, as Rabbi Yehuda Levi describes. It's an extremely different outlook towards why we keep mitzvot, and playing with these two really can help us. Even when having a discussion. Jack, when Martin was asking me about, he's setting times up for the davening, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, when do you start, when do you end, this and that, and I'm looking up when the sun rises, sun sets, and these kind of things. So you can look at it as a technicality at 4:60, at 4:16 and 13 seconds, okay. And then if you do it at 4:17, it's too late. If you do it at 4:14, or you can say, what does it mean that we daven Maariv evening after sunset, right? And why does Maariv start with the Maariv Aravim, the prayer that God is the one that brings about sunset, right? Why does the holiday start when the sun goes down, right? Because it really goes back to Bereshis, right? It reminds us of Genesis, where it's the evening precedes, darkness precedes light. And there's all kinds of ideas and lessons that you could think about and start thinking about these things. It's not because of a magical force field that all of a sudden when 4:16 hits, everything changes, right? At least that would be a Maimonidean argument. But you should be thinking, what happens at 4:16? The sun goes down. That's pretty cool. The cycles of the sun have a lot of meaning, and why do we pray at those times? Why do we pray Maariv when it's dark and we're feeling unsafe, or things like that? There's so much, there's 1,000 directions you can go into, and I'm not here to say which one is good or not. But if you go ahead and start making things up on your own and saying, yeah, you know what, nowadays it doesn't really matter anymore when the sun goes up and down because we have lights, so we can start Shabbat whenever we want, once you start doing that, and then eventually you can end up, the whole thing becomes a shell, and you missed half of what the Torah is teaching us, because you might have been completely wrong as to what the Torah was trying to teach. You're going to miss the opportunity and chance to find lessons in the Torah because you just stopped doing it, So, and that is the danger that the Kuzari is pointing out, which is a very important danger for us to keep in mind. Be humble. We don't always know the reason. And not, there is one, but we have to figure it out. Anyway, I went over my usual time, so I think I should stop. But if there's any quick questions or comments, I'll keep going. Does anyone want to contribute anything else? If not, I'll say goodbye till next week. Next week, there is a Tuesday night Mesilat Yesharim for those that want, and then there's Wednesday night, Amir Hashem, God willing, a Kuzari class. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
You too. Thank you, Saul.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.